Okay, did someone else join? I don't think so. Okay. Okay, and okay. So, hello everyone. Um, just some announcements, and I'm looking at that now. I hope I spelled announcements correctly. That looks kind of weird right now. Anyway, just so you know, and you may have already seen this. Just want to make sure, am I recording? Yes. Lab 1 is now graded on Canvas. And so if you go into grades, you should see how you did and comments and so forth. Let me know if you're not seeing that. Overall, really good job. It was really enjoyable to read through the various styles and approaches to the question, which was the assignment, which was overall just looking at a particular organism. And so great job on adhering to the format. And yeah, um, not all of the lab assignments are going to be completely open, like this week, for example. Some of them are going to be more prescribed, so, kind of following as if it were a lab manual in a traditional online, traditional in-person lab. But overall, good job. Few folks, just remember the formatting, page numbers, title of the lab at the top of the page. So, for example, this week it's Today I'm a Biologist, Part 1, I believe. So, and, things, metadata, so date, your location, um, temperature, wind speed, the broad things. I know some folks, depending on the lab, it's going to be inside. A lot of labs are going to be outside, so those things will be relevant. So remember formatting, and then also effort. Most folks, 99% of the folks did, excellent job. I was really impressed. But for a few folks, I would like to see a little bit, more. Everyone who did the lab, I went ahead and gave you full marks. It was really good. But going forward, put some effort into it. You get into it. You put what you get out of it. What you put into it. It really can be. I know a few of you noted in your reflections that you got more out of it than you were anticipating, which is yay. It's exactly what I'm hoping for. It really is. And I had an experience if you delve into it. And so, as opposed to just doing the bare minimum, try to get into it a little bit. And I say that A, because you'll get more out of it, but B, I am going to be a little bit pickier as time goes on in terms of grading and so forth. So, let me know if you want to meet one-on-one and go over some more pointers. But overall, most folks, you're in a really good spot. So great job. Today I'm going to do a lecture on community ecology, which maybe or maybe not. You might be grateful that it's going to be shorter than the past few. So I don't think it'll I don't know, maybe half an hour or so. I don't know. Maybe a bit longer. You know how chatty I can be probably by now. Just to put it on your radar, next Monday, that's September 7th, is Labor Day. And so this is actually reflected on your syllabus, uh, but I think I'd initially put next week's quiz and the current lab as due on that day. I went ahead and rolled that over to Tuesday, the 8th, for both the lab that you're working on right now, as well as the current quiz, which is on Canvas now. Those are both going to be due on Tuesday instead of Monday, just keeping in mind that Labor Day is a holiday, and take it, take the holiday. I don't want you to have something due on that day. So yes, so that's now on Canvas as those dates. So no lecture on that day. I won't record. I won't be on the link. I won't be recording anything. So there's only going to be one lecture next week. That will be on Wednesday. Um, and then lab 3, which is not on your plate right now, but kind of in keeping with the one lab per week schedule. Lab 3 will be posted on Wednesday as well, and it'll still be due the Monday after that. So it'll be a good lab, I think. But I won't post anything. There's nothing going on Monday. That's the basic gist of it. You got some stuff going on Tuesday and some stuff going on Wednesday next week. And quiz 2, which pertains to the population unit that we've been in so far, population ecology, and then today community ecology. That is due next Tuesday as well. So not Monday is the normal pattern is going to be, but Tuesday. Okay, and we're gonna just to confirm. I'm using a different microphone here. Can you hear me? Okay. Is everything coming through? Okay, good. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, I appreciate that. So just to recap on the lecture from last time, population ecology, a little bit of an easier, more succinct format here. Question 1 is compare an exponential growth model to a logistic growth model. Remember, models being one of the two methodologies that population ecologists use to study populations. The exponential growth model assumes that a population has unlimited resources, which can be useful to get a handle on what a population is doing under really specific circumstances. The example I gave you was after a fire, where there's lots of resources available. The initial plants and animals that are moving in after a fire has cleared everything out. For the purposes of a model, those organisms really do have access to a lot of resources, more than they can use, so unlimited, for lack of a better term. That's an exponential growth model. And then logistic is really more useful in the vast majority of circumstances if you want to try to get a handle to predict what a population might respond to under certain circumstances with limited resources. So things like limited water, limited time, limited space, limited nutrients, species interactions, and this is even getting to the community level. Right here, we're keeping it more or less to populations, and so forth. So exponential versus logistic. Why are models useful in ecology? As been alluded to a little bit already, they enable you to anticipate how populations perform if you assume certain conditions. Basically, it gives you predictive power, and having the ability to predict with a certain degree of certainty, not 100%, but even 70% can be pretty good. If you have if there's a 70% chance that something will happen based on past data, that can be really useful. That's what meteorologists say, weather people say all the time. Today we have a 90% chance of rain, a 10% chance of rain, etc. That's a model, and that can be very useful. Oh, this is already popping up here. Define carrying capacity, which I went ahead and defined as basically the maximum number of individuals that a population can sustain given its limiting resources. So, think about it again in terms of a logistic growth model. So, basically except for really specific circumstances, as you can imagine, every population has a specific set of limiting circumstances, limiting factors: space, food, time, predation, disease, you name it. The list it can be quite extensive, things that basically stand in the way of the population being immortal and infinite and everlasting and unlimited. So carrying capacity is the maximum number of individual organisms that a population can sustain, given the vast majority of things that hold it back. Okay, and we'll explore some of those things as time goes on, for sure. Name 2 applications of population ecology. I just named 2 broadly. One is conservation, so that's a whole can of worms, which I'll hit on throughout the whole course. And the other, really kind of falls under the mantle of conservation, is ecological services, which I'll hit again on today. basically the things that we people get out of functioning, intact, healthy ecosystems. So things like clean air and clean food and clean water and the ability to predictably produce crops and resources that we use to produce the various things that we use for our society. All of those things rely in one way or another on healthy functioning ecosystems. So it's a very valuable thing. So anyway, I digress. Community ecology is where we're going to go into today. This is chapter 20 in your textbook. The same slide as you've seen before, we're in the ecology unit, and we've described how ecology is broken into these increasingly complex levels. So we've explored the individual and the population levels in a little detail already. Today, we're going to explore the next tier up, which is the community level. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and define community to you as the assemblage of all populations in a given space. Okay, so community, it's a bit more complex, understand? It's all the populations in the same place at the same time. So remember, the definition of an ecological population is being the same species in the same place at the same time. An ecological community, it's a little bit, makes sense, right? It's the next tier up. It's the group of, it's all the same populations in the same place at the same time. So that allows for now different species interacting with one another. So it's the study of how interactions between species affect the structure and organization of ecological communities. Okay, but before we even get into community dynamics and community level processes, we have to define, I think, what a species actually is. Species is yet another one of those words, like populations, like models, that people kind of use in the common vernacular all the time, right? We say species this and species that. So we kind of already have a broad idea of what a species is. But as has been the pattern already, the biological definition of a species is a little bit different from the common vernacular, okay? So, even within the biological field today, professional biologists who study this and who get really into it, there is still, believe it or not, some contention about what exactly a species is. A species, what we call a species, is, after all, just a thing that we humans in our science of ecology, in our science of biology, have created to try to get a handle on the complexity of life. And life is really complex. It resists categorization in all sorts of ways. And so there's still some debate about what constitutes a biological species. And there's a number of different models and concepts that have attempted to define it through time. I'm not going to go into all of them because some of them are kind of weird and wonky and obsolete. Others of them have merit. But generally speaking, generally, the vast majority of biologists today, this isn't so controversial anymore, even though there are some people who disagree with it. Generally speaking, the vast majority of biologists today, and I would consider myself part of this number, accept what's called the biological species concept. Okay, so thankfully it's a fairly straightforward name. It doesn't have some kind of esoteric name to it. It's the biological species concept, which basically contests, and this again is not something that's absolutely set in stone. It's not a law. It's not even an accepted hypothesis. It's just a concept. It's a working definition. But the biological species concept defines species as individual organisms that actually interbreed in nature. They interbreed in nature and produce viable offspring. And by viable, we mean the offspring of a sexual interaction are themselves capable of producing offspring. Okay, so they're not sterile. Okay, so just because organism A and organism B are able to interbreed and produce a living, breathing offspring. If that offspring is sterile, that's not going to go for the long run, right? Because the offspring, can't have offspring itself. Okay, so there's two things. For something to be considered a biological species under the biological species concept, the organisms have to actually interbreed in nature. Okay, so there's things that could interbreed in nature but don't for whatever reason. Okay, so that would kind of, that can kind of count out certain things under this concept. We'll explore some of those. And then, even if things do interbreed in nature, they have to have offspring that are viable, that they themselves are not sterile. And so that's kind of a really broad definition right off the bat. Something that's considered a species doesn't necessarily mean that it looks alike. Okay, and we'll explore some examples of that. Okay, so right off the bat, let's go ahead and say what a species is not. And here's one good example. Maybe you've heard of this. When I was a kid, I actually got to go see Siegfried and Roy in Las Vegas. I don't know if anyone remembers Siegfried and Roy. They were a very successful performing duo who did all kinds of tricks with big cats, and their show got ended because I think it was Roy got very got clobbered by one of the animals, unfortunately. And of course nowadays ethical standards in the field of animal treatment probably wouldn't even go for having performing lions in a show anyway. I digress. Siegfried and Roy had ligers in their show, and maybe you've never heard of a liger before, but basically a liger is the offspring of a lion and a tiger, whether it's a mom tiger or a mom lion with a father tiger or a father lion. Either situation works. But ligers, here it is, they're actually larger than either tigers or lions. And I think this is kind of an artist's rendition. This is probably, I think it's a little bit artificial, but this is really, on the left here, this is really more, and there's a normal sized human woman standing next to a liger, just to give you an idea about how large these cats are. They're big. Okay, that's more characteristic of what a liger looks like. Ligers are not species. They're one-off events. So for one, lions and tigers in nature, generally their ranges do not overlap, right? Tigers are very rare on a global scale. I mean, they've got a handful of populations left in like the tropical forests of India, maybe some a little bit towards Southeast Asia. Fewer than 10,000 left in the wild, and then a few more northerly populations of tiger up pushing north towards Siberia. And there's different species of tigers still. So tiger is kind of one of the, there's different species of tigers, of course. But whatever the case may be, tigers, none of their ranges, generally speaking, overlap with lions. And I'm thinking like African lions. So think of like Lion King, the savannah. Okay, so their ranges certainly do not overlap. So in nature, they certainly would not interbreed. But even if their ranges did overlap and they were interbreeding, under the definition of the biological species concept, the offspring would not be species, because ligers are, oftentimes they are sterile. They're completely sterile. Females and males, they can't have offspring in either case. But even if they are sexually viable, if they do have offspring, let's say this is a male liger, and it mates with a female lion or a female tiger, the offspring of that interaction will either be a tiger or a lion. The genetics splice themselves out after that. So this kind of hybridization in the form of a liger, it doesn't hold through the generations. Okay, so it doesn't conform to the biological species concept, and it's not a species. Plants, I might add, are way more promiscuous, and they're way weirder than large mammals. So I won't even get into plants in too much detail now because I'll save it for later. But ligers aren't a species. Okay, that's just one example. Dogs, however, are a species. Okay, and I know a lot of folks have dogs. Of course, we all kind of broadly know that dogs originally ascended from wolves, which were domesticated by our species. We domesticated wild wolves a long time ago, 10,000 plus years ago, in the original, probably Homo neanderthalis, a different species of human, probably domesticated the first wolf and bred it through time and artificial, we'll talk about artificial selection a little bit later on, not today. But all of that gave rise to the vast majority of different dog breeds that we have today. And there's a lot of different dog breeds. I'm not particularly good at them. They're all the product of artificial selection. And it's tempting to think of, I have a Labrador, you have a poodle, I have a German Shepherd, you have a pit bull. Different people have their favorites, right? They're all the same thing. From the purpose of biology, they are all the same species. A bulldog can have offspring with a Labrador, or a poodle can have, I don't want to get graphic here, but it's all possible, right? Because they can interbreed, they often do, and the offspring themselves are viable. In the common vernacular, what do we call those? Mutts, right? We call those mutts. Mutts, even though they're not purebred, they still themselves are capable of producing offspring, with the exception of a couple mechanical difficulties. And again, not to get too graphic, but a poodle might not have an offspring might not mate with a Great Dane for obvious reasons. It's just that can be a little bit. Those are the exceptions rather than the rule. But domestic dogs are a species, right? They conform to the biological species concept. Okay, and just to give you another example, under the biological species concept, as long as they're interbreeding in nature and producing viable offspring, that's what constitutes a species. A species does not necessarily mean that you look alike. Humans certainly are an example of that. Look at human diversity, and then look at plant diversity. Look at this picture. Plant population right here. Ooh, this is all one plant population. This isn't only the same species. This is the same population of flowers. Okay, so remember, a population is the same place, the same species at the same time. Okay, so there can be two populations of the same species, and two populations can look pretty different, even though they're the same species, and they could, in theory, interbreed with one another. They don't. They're separated by time and space. But this is the same population, existing in the same place at the same place in the same time. These are Castanea exerstra, which is owl's clover. It's a parasitic plant, actually. And look at that diversity, that phenotypic diversity within the same population of flowers, the same population of plants. It's pretty amazing, right? You might see these all growing in the same field and think that they're all different flowers. Well, they're not. That's pretty tremendous variation right there. Okay, and that leads to a very, very, and I can't emphasize this enough, very important term that you're going to see many times throughout the rest of the class. We'll have an entire lecture devoted to it at one point near the end, which is biodiversity. Okay, and this is a very, very commonly used term. Now, when I was going to college, oh golly, like 10 plus years ago, this was kind of a newly coined term. I remember using the term biodiversity, and the professors weren't even that comfortable with the term yet. It was, it's been in use for a number of decades, but it hasn't been very commonly used up until the last 10-ish years. It's a very commonly used term now. You'll hear about it if you watch Planet Earth, or if you check out the Tohono Conservancy website. It's thrown out there as just another one of those commonly used words. And so, the name itself is fairly intuitive in a way. Biodiversity, that it sounds fairly intuitive, right? But there's names can be deceiving. There's a lot that goes into biological diversity or biodiversity. So in the broadest sense possible, It's a metric of the variety of life in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So for example, I say that Tejon Ranch has a lot of biodiversity. The biodiversity on Tejon Ranch is very diverse. You might also say that the Mojave Desert has a lot of biodiversity, or you might even say that 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 10-acre field of Joshua trees and all the annual plants growing with the Joshua trees there. That's a very biodiverse field. It can be applied to different habitats, different ecosystems on a variety of scales, but that's one thing. Okay. There's actually a lot of different things that can go into biological diversity. So just to break down a few examples, and this list is certainly not exhaustive, right? But first of all, species richness, which is kind of what maybe you think of right off the bat in terms of biodiversity. It's literally species richness is literally the number of species. Okay, so count them. Okay, this community has 250 species in it. Okay, so this species is 250 rich, right? That's species richness. Flip the coin a little bit. That doesn't really tell you all that much, right? Because what's missing in just a simple count of species? That number itself doesn't tell you anything about the relative abundance of those different species. Okay, so the other side of the coin in these two terms, species richness and species diversity, are not mutually exclusive. They kind of go together. Species diversity is the abundance of the different species in a community relative to one another. So a particular community might have 250 total species, but 240 of those might be plants, or 240 of them might be insects, whatever the case may be. 5 birds, 5 mammals, just to give a really broad example, right? So species diversity and species richness, they kind of go hand in hand, but that's not all that biodiversity is. You can also have things like genetic diversity, which we'll have an entire unit on genetics. So right now we're just mentioning it. That's a measure of gene flow, abundance, and quality, movement through a community. Okay, so genetics is certainly an aspect. And then ecosystem diversity, which is all of this: species richness, species diversity, genetic diversity, all of these things, but then with any abiotic factors that can be influencing how the community is functioning. So things like wind and moisture and temperature and nutrients and elevation and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ecosystem diversity are the abiotic factors that can make the complexity even more complex. So biodiversity, and again, this list is not exhaustive. I mean, it can go, there can be more dashes here that are components of biodiversity, right? Those are just a few of the big ones. Okay, so biodiversity, a really, really important term. Just to give you a pictorial example of richness versus species richness versus diversity, looking at two communities here, in this case, two communities of trees. Okay, so community one, it had, both of these communities have the same richness, right? They both have 4 different species of trees: species A, species B, species C, and species D. But they differ in their species diversities, right? Species or diversity in community one has the same exact species diversity. It's 25% representation of everything. Whereas community two is dominated, and that's an ecological term there, dominance, which is a huge term. You might hear me throw that out there, even though I'm not defining it here on the slide. A community that's dominated by a particular species is something like community two here. And this is very common in ecology, to have an ecosystem that's dominated by a particular species. Okay, so community two has a different species diversity than community one, where 80% of the diversity is this one tree species here. And then you have rarer species, so in this case, looks like species C here is very rare in this particular community. The same richness, different diversity. Okay, so see how these two terms, they kind of go hand in hand. You always have a richness, and you always have a diversity for every particular biological community. So why does biodiversity matter? As I said, this is This is a really important term, okay? It's kind of bleeding over even outside of the ecological sciences now into the common vernacular. For example, California in 2018 passed a biodiversity initiative. You can look it up, look up the California Biodiversity Initiative on Google. The cover photo, I might add, is Tejon Ranch. You know, that's a whole other story. But you know, it's starting to bleed over into law, and you know, I don't really watch the news or anything, but you know, last time they were talking about it, even in terms of common vernacular. And this gets a little bit into subjective territory here. You know, as a scientist, I try to stick to the objective stuff. But you know, why does biodiversity matter? It's a little bit subjective. It's a little bit opinion. So I'll give you a little bit of opinion here. Um, but you know, there's a lot of reasons why biodiversity can matter. Um, some might, and I'll have an entire lecture on this. So this is just a taster. But aesthetic reasons, all right. You know, so you know, go to Yellowstone National Park, go to the Mojave Desert, go to you know, any piece of conserved land anywhere. Tejon Ranch is another good example. And you know, a lot of folks really appreciate the beauty of the outdoors, the aesthetic beauty. We get our spirits renewed by being outdoors and hiking and camping, and you know, it's kind of very much ingrained into our culture, right? Now that's a wonderful thing if you enjoy taking advantage of the aesthetic resources. Certainly a landscape, a scenic landscape of trees and rivers and so forth is a lot more beautiful than I don't know, you know, something like a nuclear bomb site. You know, that's just an extreme. Those are polar opposites, right? So the aesthetics there are aesthetics are one reason, you know, why biodiversity matters. Another is recreational, kind of goes along with that. So if you enjoy camping, if you enjoy hiking, if you enjoy water skiing, you enjoy scuba diving, you enjoy fishing, you know, whatever the case may be, um, that's you know, that's another reason why biodiversity matters. Lastly, and again, I say this is a subjective way. I know not everyone comes from a faithful perspective and background. I myself, I do. I'm a Christian, so I'm certainly not attempting to give you anything here other than my own viewpoint. But you know, a lot of religions, you know, pretty much all major religions in the world teach that you know, nature, which biodiversity is something that is something to be conserved and something to be stored and something to be appreciated. Okay, so there's a religious / spiritual component there that really can't be ignored. But getting back to the objective stuff, and this is a little bit subjective still. This is a term that I've already thrown at you a little bit already, but ecosystem services is an increasingly commonly used term. And what we mean by that is the economic benefit that human systems, our economy, our industry, our well-being, our health, all of these things that we get directly out of functioning, intact, healthy ecosystems that are biodiverse, okay? All of the things that we get, what do we get out of it? Well, that's ecosystem services, and it's really hard to place a number on, and it's not, you know, if you think about like a state's GDP, you know, I forget how much GDP our country has. You know, it's up there, right? Every nation has a GDP, but we often think about that in terms of like, you know, what are we producing? What are we importing? What are we exporting? But you know, oftentimes we don't think about the things that are kind of completely ancillary and above that. What enables people to produce those things? What enables people to import and export? Well, they're probably healthy, and they're probably using things like water, and they're probably depending on the ability of the atmosphere to cycle nutrients that give our bodies the things that we need to survive, et cetera, et cetera. Pollinating crops that give us food. All of these things are tied in various really complex ways. You know, all of this is ecosystem service. There are examples of ecosystem services, and so it's really hard to tie that into like a you know, robust, definite GDP. I mentioned last time something called a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which reassesses every 10 years. So we're due for it now in 2020. It may already be out. I haven't really looked. But the last Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2010 estimated that on an annual basis, ecosystem services, globally speaking, was $33 trillion, which at that time, not accounting for inflation by today, but at that time, 10 years ago, was 3 times the gross domestic product of all the nations in the world. Okay, and again, when you're talking about a number as big as $33 trillion, that number is so astronomically high, you can only estimate that. I don't know how many orders of magnitude that number really is. And I don't pretend to know how that number was derived, but it's clearly a very big number that is hard to, kind of take a political stance on. I don't know of any politicians that are out there talking about ecosystem services in a really robust way, but there it is. Okay, that's why biodiversity matters for all of those reasons, but the one that I'm talking about most here is in the context of ecosystem services. Okay, and again, we'll talk about all these things in more detail a little bit later on, I think in the last lecture of the course actually, but biodiversity on a global scale is very noticeably going down, especially in the last 50 years or so. And there's a variety of reasons for it. This again is a bit political, and I'm not trying to do any kind of political stuff right now, especially. In fact, I'm fasting from politics because it's just unhealthy for me. But anyway, from a scientific perspective, I am a scientist, and I do read the peer-reviewed literature, and the data is pretty clear that biodiversity is declining, and there's things that should be done about it for ethical reasons as well as for ecosystem services reasons if we want civilization to continue. There's a variety of different causes for it, so things like habitat destruction, invasive species, overexploiting resources, pollution. You've probably heard of these things before. We'll explore them in more detail later. The reality is that, again, we'll talk about this in more detail later, is that our technological ability as human beings has reached a point where we outpace the planet's ability to regenerate itself. And so in order for the planet to keep producing for us at the rate that we are currently consuming, there needs to be, I don't see any other way. If there were, that would be wonderful. There has to be, government sanctions, government rules in place that protect ecosystem services and biodiversity itself. And so you've heard of a number of these. I don't know why I'm calling this the Invasive Species Act. I think maybe I was a bit tired when I wrote it. I think I meant to say the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, which was passed in the 1970s, the National Environmental Quality Act. In California, we have an even stricter version of that, the California Environmental Quality Act. These are just some broad examples. For example, back when a lot of these laws were first being passed in the 1970s, they have pictures of what Los Angeles looked like on a typical day. And you're looking out like from a Hollywood sign toward downtown Los Angeles, and you can't see anything. It looks like a big white haze from Davy Jones' Locker, because the smog was so bad. And now, they've done like annual pictures for the same picture taken over time ever since they passed the Clean Air Act. And, air has become way more breathable, which is a good thing. Here in Kern, you may already know this, especially here in Bakersfield, especially with the recent fires, we have the worst air quality in the nation. You probably knew that, and I'll talk about that some later on. But we still have measurably benefited from. I digress. I can keep going on and on and on and on. We'll talk about this in more detail later. Okay, let's carry on. In the context of community ecology, we open up a whole other tier of complexity, because we're not just talking about individual species interacting, individual organisms in a population interacting with one another. we're talking about species interacting with one another, right? So as opposed to a population where, you know, lion A is interacting with lion B, and they're kind of doing their thing. Now you have species interacting. So first of all, let's distinguish between inter and intra-specific interactions. Intra-specific interactions are interactions within a species. And so that's what people do when we talk to one another, and we, all of the things that people do, a lot of things, right? Those are all intra-specific interactions. When a lion, cleans another lion, or a monkey, feeds a monkey, whatever the case may be, or a mother bird feeds its chicks. Those are all examples of intra-specific interactions in the context of populations, right? In the community world, when you go to the next tier up, there are a lot more things going on, a lot more complexity, because now species are interacting with one another. Populations are now interacting with one another. Okay, so that's inter-specific interactions, right? Okay, so inter versus intra-specific interactions. Okay, so in the context of an ecological community, I'm going to go ahead and define this term here in italics of an ecological niche. Okay, so within a community, each population has a specific niche, which is sort of where that population, where that species actually, is situated relative to all the other species in that community. So it's the total use of biotic and abiotic resources. It's the lion. It's the lions in the savannah. Their niche is eating the gazelle and eating the antelope and eating the giraffes, and it's shading under the acacia trees. It's drinking at a certain spot at the water hole, or a fish in a kelp forest. Its ecological niche is eating the little growths on the algae. Or it's eating other fish smaller than it. All of the different ways that you can imagine a particular species, a particular population is sort of where it's situated, where it's rooted in a community. That is that population's ecological niche within the context of a wider community. Okay, so that's kind of a term that I'm going to use, free will going forward. A little bit further, in the context of a community, is another thing, which is something called the competitive exclusion principle. Again, these italic terms are important. These are key terms, for lack of a better, vocabulary terms, right? If two ecological niches are too similar, they cannot coexist. It kind of sounds philosophical, right? So think about it in the context of an ecological community. If there are two populations in the same community coexist, it cannot go along that way forever. Eventually, something's got to give. Okay, so this is actually right here. These pictures here are one of the best studied examples of the competitive exclusion principle. This is an East Coast bird example. So they're not birds that we have here in California. So think of like East Coast, New York, Virginia, the Carolinas, places like that. But it's one of the foundational studies that first kind of posited the competitive exclusion principle. So this is an old paper. They studied over a long period of time Virginia's warblers and orange-crowned warblers, which are obviously two species of birds, but they exist in the same community. Okay, so population of Virginia's warbler and population of orange-crowned warbler. They're both warblers, right? So even though they're two separate species, they look very distinct. They don't interbreed and so forth. So they're definitely two different species, two different populations. They're nevertheless really similar to one another, right? They eat the same food resources. They want to nest in the same types of trees. et cetera, et cetera. They have the same types of calls, right? So all those similarities, eating the same types of foods, wanting to nest in the same places, wanting and having very similar calls, which might confuse, this bird calling out right here has the same sound as this bird calling out right here. Well, what if the birds can get confused, right? They're trying to talk to the other members of its same species, but they're hearing the same call from the other species, so they're just too similar, right? The competitive exclusion principle states that if these two niches, in this case, the Virginia's warbler versus the orange crown warbler, if they're too similar, eventually something's got to give, okay? This is another example, this graph here is another example of they've done bacterial cultures. In this case, these two, penicillium, I think, the genus Penicillium, which is the genus that we get the antibiotic from, as you can imagine. They've done these two, plated them in cultures. Think of things like, bacterial plates. Think of like movies where they're studying. Think of I Am Legend. If anyone's seen Will Smith's I Am Legend movie, he's working with bacteria and he has these petri plates. Okay, so imagine somebody's working with bacteria and petri plates. We would be doing this if we were meeting in person. But they've studied how these two species of penicillium, they abide by the competitive exclusion principle. If they're in separate cultures, they perform very well. But if they're combined in the same culture, eventually something gives. One species wins out. The other species, either has to go away or has to change its behavior somehow, get a different food resource, or it dies. So it dies out completely locally. So that's what you get. So the competitive exclusion principle and the ecological niche, those are two really important terms. And we'll hit on them again. I never put anything to bed ever permanently. We'll definitely talk about every concept we talk about, we'll talk about again. So just to give you some examples of different types of interspecific interactions. Remember, there are many potential types of interspecific interactions. Ecology just gets more complex the higher tiers you get. Okay, so one type of interspecific interactions in the context of ecological communities are mutualisms. Okay, and as the name suggests, mutual means both sides get something. So these are examples where both species are getting something out of interacting with one another. Okay, so you've probably recognized this right off the bat: the clownfish and the anemone, right? The clownfish, obviously, and think of a Finding Nemo, right? And I'm sure most of you have seen Finding Nemo. Do you want this anemone to sting you? No, you don't. So that was a bad joke. Anyway, it's a mutualism. Obviously, the anemone and the clownfish are two different species, and so when they're interacting, that's an interspecific interaction. This is a community interaction. The clownfish gets protection. It has specialized cells that prevent it from being stung by the anemone, and in turn, the anemone gets cleaned. The clownfish actually eats the little parasites that grow amongst the anemone. And so the clownfish gets protection. Think about that opening scene from Finding Nemo, that really sad scene that always makes me cry, where Nemo's whole family except for his dad get eaten by the barracuda, right? And why did Marlin not die? Because the barracuda knocks him into the anemone, and the barracuda, it protected Marlin, right? And in exchange, the anemone gets the clownfish eat the parasites off of the anemone, and so it helps the health of the anemone. I'm spending too long on this example, so I'll go quicker through the rest. Obviously, a bee and a flower, they're both getting something out of this interaction. The bee gets pollen, which it then uses to make into honey, which is its food. The flower gets, that's how flowers reproduce, right? Pollinators moving from flower to flower. and basically moving its genetic material from one plant to another. That's how plants reproduce. Here, the wildebeest and these two magpies. It's a well-studied example. The magpies eat the bugs that surround the wildebeest. A well-studied example. It's certainly not constrained to these two species, but that both benefit. The magpies get an abundant source of food that they wouldn't be able to find away from the wildebeest, and the wildebeest doesn't have to put up with as many those darn flies and so forth. It's pretty much the same thing here with the whale shark and the cleaner fish. Think they're very ancillary to the clownfish and the anemone. So same thing going on here. This is an ant in the acacia tree, which is a well-known mutualism where the ants eat the nectar off of the acacia tree, these specialized buds here, and in return, the ants defend the acacia trees from other predators, other insects, for example, that might want to eat the leaves of the acacia tree. And here's one really cool example of an interspecific interaction of mutualism. This is, I think, fair enough to demonstrate to call this a mutualism. It's actually kind of a dying tradition, but there are these fishermen in China that have for centuries trained these cormorants to fish for them, where they tie a rope around the cormorant's neck and then throw it into the river. And then the cormorants go get fish, and the rope prevents the cormorants from swallowing the fish. And they then come back up to the boat here, and they cough up the fish, and the fisherman basically gets a free meal without having to do anything. The cormorant did all the work, but in return, these are the fisherman's pets, and the fisherman feeds the cormorants a better diet than simply fish, and takes care of it, gives them medicine, heals any wounds, things like that. And the cormorants that are in the care of the fishermen, they live longer, they have a longer lifespan than wild cormorants. These are all mutualisms. I'm taking way too long here, so I'll go through quicker. Predation is another example of an interspecific interaction, obviously, where one species eats another. So one species is clearly benefiting, the other species is clearly not. An offshoot, a response of predation is mimicry, where it's an adaptation for actual predator avoidance. And this is, again, another example of an interspecific interaction where one species actually copies another species for some kind of benefit, right? So think about this chameleon here, this Pacific chameleon that's using a form of mimicry, camouflage, to blend in with this leaf here. Obviously, it probably avoids some predation by doing that. And then you've obviously heard me talk at length about the king snake versus coral snake example. The coral snake being venomous, the king snake not being venomous, but that same kind of color pattern enables the king snake to avoid predation, because predators might think that it's the coral snake, and they'll want to avoid it because they think it's venomous, even though it's not. Okay, host-parasite interactions. I'm not going to spend too long on these since they're fairly obvious, where one species is victimized by another species, but unlike predation, in host-parasite interactions, the parasite does not want the host to die, usually, right? At least not immediately. It wants the parasite to keep on living so that it can keep on getting a food source. So think of things like mosquitoes, biting into your skin. Has anyone gotten bit by that new population of mosquitoes that all of a sudden we have here in Bakersfield this summer that never seemed to exist before this year? I digress. The mosquitoes probably don't want you to die because they want your blood, and you need to be alive for them to have blood. I'm going to stop myself from even going here. Just ignore it because that's a huge story, and I'll talk forever about it. This one here is actually a plant. It's a parasitic plant. It's often tempting to think about plants as photosynthetic organisms that are always green, but that's actually not the definition of a plant. I'll have a whole lecture on plants. This is another thing I'll have to stop myself from going on and on about. But this is actually a plant called witch's hair that's completely parasitic. It kind of looks like string cheese, but it's truly a plant. It has flowers, it has roots. but it completely parasitizes other plants. And this is another example of a parasitic plant this is mistletoe, which actually is a number of different genera, but it parasitizes, in this case, oak trees. I won't go there because I want to talk about the geographic mosaic of coevolution at another time, so ignore that for now because I'm already going over my commitment. I said I would take a half an hour. We're already up to an hour somehow. Oh my goodness. So I'm almost done though. So trophic structure, you know, I'm going to go quickly here because this is fairly intuitive, and I'm sure you've heard of this before. But I'm sure you've heard of trophic structures before in the context of communities, where you have these different tiers of a food chain from the base level here. If anyone went to Camp Keep, for example, growing up, you know, if you were a lucky person who got to go to Camp Keep, I got to go to Camp Keep. That was a lot of fun. Actually, some of my biology buddies work for Camp Keep now. It's so weird to have colleagues who did that. It's a whole other story. But if you went to Camp Keep, you probably learned about producers and consumers, right? The difference between producers and consumers. So things like plants and phytoplankton, and then the things that eat the producers are the primary consumers, and the things that eat the primary consumers are the secondary consumers, all the way on up to the high apex predators, the carnivores that eat the things that nothing else eats them, right? So this is very intuitive. It's basically the passage of energy from one tier to the next in the context of an ecological community. So there's lots of interactions going on here. There's mutualisms, there's predations, there's host-parasite interactions, you name it. It's all part of the trophic structure, right? This is a community here. One important term that I'll throw in here is biological magnification, which is the general tendency of environmental toxins to become more concentrated at higher trophic levels. So this is, for example, why a lot of OBs suggest that pregnant women don't eat sharks, for example, or tuna, which are high tier quaternary type consumers, apex predators. Why? Because of biomagnification. The highest level of communities, the highest tier of communities, they've obviously eaten everything down beneath them. Okay, so, you know, in this example, the grasshopper eats the flower, the mouse eats the grasshopper, the snake eats the mouse, and the bird eats the snake. Think about that example we talked about earlier. Okay, so that by the time the bird is eating the snake, the bird is absorbing all of the toxins that existed, that accumulated in each tier going on up. So increase biomagnification of environmental toxins. Think of things like mercury, just keeps going up and up and up, you know, the higher level you go. So for example, human beings are the worst. You know, you may not know, you know, this is a bit of a macabre, morbid example, but you know, it varies by country. But in this country, for example, the United States, if someone passes away, it's illegal to just go bury that person in your backyard. There are, you know, procedures that have to be done in mortuaries and stuff, and there's a certain legal way to bury somebody in the ground. The reason why is because human bodies, because of, you know, our food chain, because of we're apex predators, you name it, we're omnivores, our bodies tend to be full of environmental toxins. And so if you bury a human body in the ground, you know, unprotected, this is kind of nasty, but, you know, those toxins can leach out and actually destroy water sources. I mean, there's examples of this. It's a very nasty example, but there you go. Biological magnification. I talk about that because it's kind of it's macabre, it's morbid, it's sad, but it's also true. Okay, there's a lot of true things that are also sad. Okay, and then keystone species. I think this is my last slide. In the context of communities, a keystone species is a species in a community that has a disproportionately positive role relative to its abundance and total. It might, so think back to species diversity versus species richness. Okay, species diversity was the relative abundance of different species to one another in a context of a community. A keystone species is a species in a community that's not even necessarily the most abundant, not necessarily the most dominant species in a community. It might even be a rare species in the community, but it has a disproportionately positive function relative to the community as a whole. So to give you, so in other words, it pulls more than its own weight. To give you an example, and probably the most often talked about example, are sea otters, California sea otters in the California Bight, California intertidal marine systems. Sea otters are a keystone species for a variety of reasons, but one huge reason is that sea otters, they eat things like, and I don't have a picture here, they eat purple sea urchins, which are a native species, but they can get out of hand. And if purple sea urchins get too dominant, they will eat the base of the kelp in a lot of intertidal zones in California, basically the whole West Coast. And the kelp is basically the habitat for all of the fish that live in the kelp. Without the kelp there, the fish wouldn't be able to survive. And there's millions of species of fish, right? So without the sea otters, so they're, the sea otters, were nearly hunted to extinction at one point in our history. People like sea otter fur for hats, and they like to make, shaving brushes. I myself, I inherited it. I didn't buy it new. I inherited it from my grandfather. I have a badger brush that I use for shaving. Thankfully, you can't really get those easily these days because you can't really hunt otter. It's illegal. But at one point, sea otter fur, sea otters have a denser hair per follicle density than basically most other mammals. It's really dense and it's really water resistant. It's really useful for human purposes, but people were overhunting them. And so, you get instances where the sea otters were completely eradicated from the ecological community of the intertidal zone. And when the sea otters weren't there, they weren't eating the sea urchins. And if the sea urchins weren't being eaten by the sea otters, their populations exploded. And when their populations exploded, they ate all the kelp, and the kelp forests would go away. And if the kelp forests went away, there weren't any fish. All the fish, that destroyed their habitats. The species, those fish were what's called locally extirpated. Locally, they weren't able to live there anymore, and that affected higher tier levels of the trophics. The higher fish, the sharks, and it affected the whole community, right? And then people were gotten involved because fisheries, people who make their living off of fishing, the fisheries were impacted, and people would lose their livelihoods. And so, and I say, I am talking mostly in the context of California sea otters right now, but sea stars also fit the same bill. Sea stars, they do the same thing. They eat sea urchins, and so they form the same function. So sea otters, to get back to the original point, sea otters are keystone species because if sea otters aren't there, community function ceases. And thankfully, there have been, sea otters are a protected species now. You can't hunt them. And they've been members of captive breeding programs. You can see sea otters in the wild now. It's still not that common, but you can see them. Now, thanks to them, you have healthy intact systems, which is why you can go to the coast and get a fresh seafood meal, because of that. So with that, thank you for hanging out, Morgana. I know I talk a lot, but any questions? Feel free to throw them up there, and folks on the recording as well. There's 35 people in the class now. Oh, Just so you know, Friday is Census Day, which means that as the instructor, I have the responsibility of sorting out the final class roster by this Friday. And I think it's the last date that you can drop the class without getting like a W attached to your transcript. So just so you know there are a handful of people still on the wait list. So if you know, I think there's two people that haven't participated at all yet who haven't submitted anything. If you're listening and you're one of those people, let me know what's going on. Maybe you're probably not even watching this, but just so as you know, this Friday is Census Day, the 4th. So anyway, um, just you know, to keep it on your radar, you got quiz 2 that's now live on Canvas, lab 2, which is the Today I'm a Biologist lab that's also live on Canvas. Both of those are going to be due uh, on Tuesday, September 8th, not on Monday as they would normally be. We're not going to meet on Monday. I'm not going to record anything. You know, we're only going to have one lecture next week. There'll still be a lab, there'll still be a quiz out, but nothing's going on Monday. I hope you have a happy Labor Day. I hope you get the day off. If you are working, I hope you earn extra money. Anyway, uh, with that, I think I'll sign out unless Morgana, you have any questions. I'll stop recording anyway. Uh, no, okay, no questions. You're welcome. I'm gonna have a good evening, everyone, and please don't hesitate to call me or email me, I should say, if you have any questions. Other than that, I'll keep doing have a great weekend too, and you know, otherwise I'll keep posting stuff on Canvas and carry on. So anyway, have a good evening, everyone. Take care.